Hi, Neil here, LeBron. There are kids playing outside and the occasional dog barking, so even though I look like I'm alone in my room, it's apparently very full. Um, I want to talk about the theory of utilitarianism. It is the reading that I've assigned. And let me start out by making maybe an obvious distinction, but it's important to get this right. It's the theory of utilitarianism. The root of that is utility. It is not related to a religious group, a Protestant Christian religious group called Unitarianism. It is not Unitarianism, it is utilitarianism. The root of utilitarianism is utility. And the main principle, in fact, of utilitarianism is called the principle of utility. The principle of utility is fairly straightforward. The principle of utility essentially says that the right act is to produce the greatest happiness or pleasure, or the best consequences for the most number of people, or the largest community of people. So we'll come back to that, but I wanted to get that right at the beginning. The we're entering now, though, talking about utilitarianism. We're entering this range of theories that's trying to explain what it is we're doing when we act morally. What is morality about? And so we judge morally, we act morally, we are moral or immoral, or we're doing something right or wrong or good or bad. And what is it that we're doing when we use these terms? And so what we are entering now is a discussion of what it is we're doing when we act morally. And one of the ways that we talk about that is to talk about our standards of moral behavior, our standards of right and wrong. So what we're looking at is, our standards of right and wrong, and whether these standards are based in some understandable principle or principles or not. Do we just pull these standards, or do we just pull these judgments that we make, that's right, that's wrong, out of thin air, or do they have some rational basis? Um, Utilitarianism is a theory that believes that our moral behavior is rationally based. We can understand why we make moral judgments and what our moral behavior is about. We can judge our judgments of that as to whether they are right or wrong. And so the theory of utilitarianism offers its views on what morality is about, and what the standards of morality are about. So so I wanted to get that right. Now, the theory of utilitarianism, which, as I've said, has to do with, or is founded in, a sort of a straightforward sounding principle, the principle of utility. The act that act is right, that produces the greatest happiness or pleasure or good for the greatest number of people, or the widest community. Um, Utilitarianism kind of goes straight at it, and so at some level, the theory of utilitarianism responds to Socrates' original question: "What is the good life?" Those of you who've had introduction to philosophy, certainly those of you, if there are any of you who've had introduction to philosophy with me, will recognize that question. I think it's hard to take a philosophy course without getting that as one of the primary guiding questions in philosophy: what is the good life? The theory of utilitarianism wants to say, essentially, that the good life is made up of good experiences. And you take all these good experiences, you put them together, and and you've got a good life. So and then you if you want to do something that is good for other people, you try to give them good experiences. So the question quickly becomes for utilitarianism, what is a good experience? And um, and what utilitarianism wants to say is that a good experience is an experience that results in a person's happiness or a person's pleasure, or a person's achieving the good, and so it looks at it like that. Now, what ultimately utilitarianism is about is to say that the good life is a life of good experiences, and good experiences are experiences that satisfy our interests, that satisfy our human individual interests. To get a community of good, you take all the individuals, you add them together, and there's your group, there's your community. So utilitarianism is saying that a, a good experience is an experience that results in happiness or pleasure, and a good experience is one that avoids pain or suffering or misery. So if you ask me, you know, if you say to me, Neil, I want to do something good for you, what would that be? I would say, well, it would be something that would give me an experience of pleasure, or give me an experience of happiness, or allow me to avoid experiences of pain. So it's one ultimately that satisfies, it's an experience that ultimately satisfies my interests. And a good life is one that satisfies many interests and does not frustrate the satisfaction of those interests, frustrating interests being what we might call pain or suffering. Um, one of the originators of the theory of utilitarianism, he's probably, I guess, best referred to as the grandfather of utilitarianism, is Jeremy Bentham. And he wrote in the latter half of the 18th century and early part of the 19th century. Bentham made this very straightforward and said that a good experience is one that is pleasurable experience. A bad experience is one that is painful. And Bentham went on to say that everything is just pleasure or pain. Everything falls under the category of pleasure or pain. What satisfies us is pleasurable. What frustrates us is painful. The theory has been complicated from then, or since then, by one of the major followers of Bentham, whose name is John Stuart Mill. And Mill said that pleasure is a more complicated experience, and it's pleasure or happiness. Well, once you're off of pleasure, you get into the idea of happiness, and happiness is a complex experience, quite likely. I can get happiness from reading a book. I can get happiness from playing a game. I could get happiness, I suppose, sitting in my chair and staring off blankly into space. All of these things can be happiness. I might also, I suppose, get happiness if you want to push on the concept some, and this is what has happened in the unfolding of the theory of utilitarianism in over 200 years. I suppose you could say I get happiness from overcoming challenges and being successful at something. So it includes a lot. One thing and so one complication of the theory is that we want to say that the good life is the life of good experiences. Well, what are good experiences? We partially want to answer good experiences are experiences that satisfy our interests. Those interests are satisfied interest is what we would call pleasure or happiness. What we find is that pleasure and happiness are probably not the same. Are probably not the same characteristic, and so the theory gets complicated relatively quickly. Um, but I think the point to see here is that is that what we're really talking about in utilitarianism is that the good life is the life of satisfied interests, and morality for utilitarians, morality is the satisfaction of human interests. I look at it like that. And when I say I mean as a professional philosopher, I look at it like that. There are, I should say, different theories about this and different opinions about this. I'm trying to give you kind of a straight shot at this. You will find different answers depending on who you, who you Google about utilitarianism. And there are probably literally tens of thousands of articles and books written on utilitarianism. So you'll find a lot of variety. My view is that utilitarianism says that morality is about the satisfaction of human interests. Um, so the principle of utility, the main idea of the theory of utilitarianism, says that the right act is the act that uh, produces the greatest happiness or pleasure or good for the greatest number of people, for the community. Um, so, what we then have to look at is that what we are interested in when we behave morally is what are the results of my actions? What are the results of somebody else's actions? In other words, what are the consequences of my action or the consequences of your action? Are the consequences of the results of your action something that satisfies my interest or something that does not satisfy my interest? And so there's an emphasis on, in the theory of utilitarianism, there's an emphasis on the consequences of actions. That's what we are interested in. And so and so what satisfies our interests are consequences that result in the satisfaction of people's interests. Now, the theory of utilitarianism says that the right act, well, let me look at it this way. The right act is the act that produces the most good. If good is defined as what is a satisfying experience for me, if good is what is the satisfies my interest or is a satisfying experience for me, then the act that produces the most satisfying experiences would be the right act. And so I want to make a distinction here between acts that are good, that satisfy some interests, and acts that are right, that satisfy the most interests. If there's 5 people, you may have Act A that satisfies 2 out of 5 of those people's interests, and you may have Act B that satisfies 4 out of the 5 people's interests. Act A that satisfies 2 would be a good act. It satisfies some interests, but Act B satisfies 4 people. It satisfies the most interest. So that's the right act. And I would have to say here, just to make it clear, that when we say satisfied, when I use the term satisfies a person's interest as being an act of pleasure or happiness, you also must keep in mind that I am also, and utilitarians are mostly also, saying that an act that avoids the most pain or that avoids pain. So this breaks down in 3 ways. Let's say that out of acts that we may do, Act A and Act B. Act A may result in pleasure. Act B may result in pain. The one that you do according to the theory of utilitarianism is you do Act A, the act that satisfies, that results in, has the consequences of pleasure. Then there is another selection where we have Act A and Act B, and Act A results in 20 units of pain, let us say, and Act B results in 50 units of pain. In other words, Act A results in some pain, but Act B results in more pain. The act that the theory of utilitarianism says that you do is Act A, the one that results in less pain than the other act. And finally, you have a third act, one that results in some pleasure, and then an act B that results in greater pleasure. So Act A results in some pleasure, Act B results in greater pleasure than Act A. You do Act B. So let me clarify that. Out of two acts, where one results in pleasure and one results in pain, the theory of utilitarianism says you do the act that results in pleasure. Out of two acts, one that results in some pain and one that results in greater pain, you do the one that results in less pain. Okay? Out of two acts, one that results in some pleasure and one that results in greater pleasure, you do the act that results in greater pleasure. So what essentially the theory of utilitarianism is saying is that you do the act that results in the most good and avoids the most bad, bad here being pain. Sometimes, and well, let me put it this way, realistically speaking, there's not it's not balanced out very pleasantly. So we are faced in our lives perhaps a lot of times where the act that we're faced with, we don't have a choice between an act that results in pleasure and an act that results in pain. We only have actions that result in greater pain or lesser pain. And so utilitarianism says, you do the one that results in lesser pain. So the theory of utilitarianism is pretty straightforward on this. There's complications just resulting from the way our acts, the pleasure or pain that our acts result in. So the other one of the other questions here is that utilitarianism says that what we're looking at is not just an act that results in my pleasure or my pain. We're looking at actions that have consequences for a group of people, and that the act that we do is the act that results in the most pleasure for the largest group of people, or the act that results in the least pain for the widest group of people, the widest number of people. So the theory of utilitarianism, the principle of utility, let me come back to that because, and so I'll say this for the fourth or fifth time, the principle of utility is the act that produces the greatest amount of pleasure or happiness or good for the greatest number of people, for the widest community. Or the right act is the act that produces the least amount of pain or suffering or misery for the greatest number of people. So the rightness or wrongness of the act is based in how wide the community is, also how large the community is. So it gives us essentially a principle of behavior, a moral principle of behavior. If we're looking at someone who's doing something, what we would say is that we might judge this person's act to be wrong, and what we mean by that is that person's wrong act is wrong because it produces great pain or greater pain than pleasure, or greater pain rather than lesser pain. If we are evaluating or judging somebody's action, we might say, it's the right act or it's a good act because that person's action results in the wider distribution, the larger community that person's act is affecting for the good, for pleasure or happiness, or good. So what utilitarianism wants to give us is a straightforward principle that allows us to evaluate the actions that we are faced with. So you have some dilemma, and you think, well, what should I do here? Utilitarianism says, figure out your range of actions, the choices that you have, pick that choice, make that selection that results in greater happiness or lesser pain for the greater community, for the greater number of people affected. That's how you figure that out. One of the ideas here, one of the implicit ideas here, and it adds to a lot of complications, is that utilitarianism, I mean, one of the main ways of thinking about utilitarianism is that it is a majoritarian theory. And it essentially says, the greatest pleasure or the least pain for the most people is the act that wins. Well, what about the people for whom the act does not result in great pleasure, or for whom the act results in great pain? How are we to consider them? One of the nasty implications of utilitarianism is that it looks like it's saying that the principle of utility, the theory of utilitarianism, it looks like it's saying, well, if a minority of people suffers pain, but the majority of people, are experiencing pleasure, too bad for the minority. I mean, that's the way it goes. They have to suffer, maybe, because the majority is getting pleasure from that. Maybe in the future, that minority will be in the majority at some time, and they'll get to experience pleasure. This runs into a lot of problems, and the selection that you read presents a number of these problems. I don't want to go too deeply into all of them, but they are, because it gets complicated. But I do want to mention some of them. There is the example that the author of the article, the author James Rachels of the article, gives of what if, and these are unfortunately examples that are taken from real life. So the author gives this example of a police department that where a woman who was abused or raped reported it to the police department, and the policeman who took that report had her take photos which were compromising, lewd photos, and for no purpose whatsoever. And it wasn't that, maybe there was a purpose. No, there was no purpose for them, except the pleasure, apparently, that the policeman had in looking at that photo. And apparently these photos were distributed throughout the department. As this is presented, this example, if you look at this from the theory of utilitarianism, that the woman, even if she found out about the distribution of these photos, which apparently she did, even when she found out, there were more people that got pleasure from these looking at these photos than her pain and suffering from knowing that people were looking at lewd photos of her that were illicitly and secretively taken. So the theory of utilitarianism seems to suggest, well, yeah, so what? So more people got pleasure and fewer people, maybe only one person really suffered from that. It must be a right act. According to the theory of utilitarianism, results in pleasure, happiness, and good experiences for many people. How does the utilitarian respond to that? The utilitarian doesn't really have much of a way of responding. It's a majoritarian theory that, it means however the majority goes, what the majority gets pleasure from or happiness from, that's the way it goes, and the minority is just out of luck. The other examples that one of the other examples that the author of the article gives is the reporting of bad behavior and by some crime in a community where the sheriff of that community, and this is hypothetical as far as I know, where the sheriff of that community blames it on a minority, blames it on a black person, because everybody thinks it's that person who did it, even though the sheriff knows that it's not that person. Wouldn't that be the right thing to do, since it will since it will avoid all this suffering if the community, riots and so on. So it at some level, utilitarianism is a nasty theory in that way. It says, you can take advantage of the minority as long as the majority is happy. How do utilitarians respond to that? Well, utilitarians say essentially that there are certain rules that are followed, that in the following of these rules, that more people will be happy than not if the rules are followed. So in the example of the woman who was violated by these pictures taken, the rule is that you can never, it is wrong to take advantage of innocent people, or to treat people unjustly or unfairly. Those are rules, the following of which is necessary for the general happiness of the community. So even though utilitarianism looks like it causes more pleasure for the community, if it violates those rules and therefore causes misery or pain for a minority, in fact, utilitarians say the rules of fairness and justice and not taking advantage of innocent people, those rules when they are followed, lead to more happiness than the violation of those rules. So utilitarians would not violate rules of justice and innocence and fairness, because in the long run, those lead to more unhappiness for the community rather than more happiness for the community. That's just one way of answering that. Whether it's a good way of answering it, I personally don't believe that, but I want you to see that how that unfolds and the difficulties that utilitarianism runs into. Ultimately, what we get to with utilitarianism is this idea of that morality is about the satisfaction of human interest, and that satisfaction is based on other people doing things that have consequences of causing pleasure or avoiding pain for the greater number of people, the greatest number of people. That's one of the main points of that, the principle of utilitarianism. And the other idea being that how do we recognize a good experience? Many utilitarians want to say that a good experience is one that results in pleasure or happiness, and allows us to avoid pain and suffering. And that's kind of some of the essentials of that theory. There are many complications to this. I'm just giving you a little talking to about this. I know the reading, the debate about utilitarianism is probably not an easy reading. But I wanted to give you some idea of how that unfolds. Hopefully, the reading will be more understandable. I will see you soon.